The ancient Kong arena glowed under the silver moonlight of Ara, casting long shadows across its weathered stone walls. For 3 centuries, the desert planet had hosted the Intimidation Challenge, a rite of passage that separated those worthy of adulthood from those who would remain forever in the shadows of immaturity. Tonight was different. Tonight, Princess Selene Oris would face her trial. At 18 years old, Selene stood tall and proud at the entrance to the arena, her silver-blue ceremonial robes billowing in the gentle desert breeze. The daughter of House Oris, her hair was braided with precious metals that caught the moonlight, and her eyes, sharp and determined, reflected the same silver glow. 6 wild beasts awaited her inside creatures that had been captured and neural locked specifically for her challenge. All she had to do was walk past them, demonstrating her courage and worthiness to someday rule. "Remember," whispered Elder Lyra, adjusting Selene's ceremonial spear, "show no fear. Fear activates their hunting instinct, even through the neural lock. You are Oris. You are strength." Selene nodded, her throat dry. The ritual words came automatically. "I am strength. I am courage. I am the future of Khan." The massive stone doors groaned open, revealing the circular arena filled with red sand. Torches illuminated the path. She would walk a straight line through 6 sequential gates, behind each of which waited a creature more terrifying than the last. The crowded stands fell silent as she took her first step. The first beast was a sand serpent, its scales the color of dried blood eyes, like burning coals. It hissed and lunged against its restraints, but the neural lock held firm, preventing it from moving more than a few inches toward her. Selene walked past spine-rigid eyes, forward. The second creature was a spined crawler, 8 legs ending in hooked claws that could tear through armor. It clicked and chittered, but remained bound by invisible neural chains. Selene passed it without breaking stride. The third was a dust wraith, a semi-corporeal being that seemed to form and reform from the very sand beneath her feet. It wailed a sound like wind through a cracked window, but could not touch her. Selene's confidence grew with each step. As she approached the 4th gate, something felt different. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, more anxious. Through the bars, she could see a massive shadow hunter, a predator, with 6 eyes and razor-sharp mandibles that could slice through bone. It paced differently than the others, had more agitated, less controlled. "Proceed, Princess," called the master of ceremonies, though even his voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Selene stepped forward. The gate rose. The shadow hunter's neural lock sparked visibly a malfunction. The creature roared a sound that penetrated flesh and rattled bone. With one violent jerk, it snapped its restraining cable and lunged directly toward Selene. Frozen in shock, the princess stood motionless as sand billowed around the charging beast. In the 300-year history of the Intimidation Challenge, no royal had ever been genuinely threatened. The observational guards scrambled, but they were too far away. Selene's scream pierced the arena, rising above the panicked crowd's roar. In that moment, she was not a princess. She was prey. From the shadows of the arena's edge, an impossible figure emerged, a human warrior, his skin marked with the exile's brand. Idris, they would later learn, was his name. With one fluid motion, he knocked his final arrow, a crude thing with a gleaming metal tip, drew his bowstring, and released. The arrow whistled through the air, striking the beast precisely at the neural junction at the base of its skull. The shadow hunter collapsed in a heap of limbs and dust, mere feet from where Selene stood trembling. Chaos erupted. Royal guards flooded the arena, surrounding both Selene and the exile who had saved her. Idris made no attempt to flee, keeping his hands visible, his bow discarded at his feet. "Seize him!" shouted the captain of the royal guard. "No exile may enter the sacred arena." But Elder Mira, the ancient keeper of laws, stepped forward from her observation booth. "Hold," she commanded, her voice cutting through the pandemonium. "The call-response law is invoked. He who saves royal blood is bound to that royal, and she to him, until the debt is settled. Murmurs of shock rippled through the crowd. The call-response law was ancient, predating even the settlement of Ara, but it had never been invoked for an exile, especially not during a royal's intimidation challenge. The captain looked to King Orion Selene's father, who sat rigid on his ceremonial throne. After a long moment, he nodded once. "The law stands," he said, though his voice was cold as desert night. "But they must leave the city until the council determines how to proceed. No failed challenge has ever occurred in the royal line." And so, as the moon reached its zenith, Princess Selene Oris and the exile Idris departed the gleaming domed capital, heading into the merciless desert beyond. Royal guards escorted them to the city limits, where they were given minimal supplies, enough for perhaps 3 days if they were careful. "I never asked for your help," Selene said, once they were alone, her voice cracking despite her attempt at royal disdain. Idris regarded her silently for a moment. He was tall and lean, weathered by the desert with dark eyes that seemed to hold the vastness of the night sky. "The beast didn't ask if you wanted to be its dinner either," he finally replied. "Out here, princess intention matters less than survival." She had no response to that. As the capital's luminous dome faded behind them, Selene felt the weight of her new reality crushing down. She had failed the challenge. Worse, she had been saved by an exile, a person cast out from Khan society, forbidden from entering the capital, considered less than human by royal standards. The first night was the hardest. Used to soft beds and climate-controlled chambers, Selene found herself huddled beneath a thin thermal blanket in a shallow cave, jumping at every sound from the darkness beyond. "The howlers won't come near the fire," Idris explained, feeding another dried bush into their small flame. "And the night crawlers avoid the smell of human." "How do you know all this?" Selene asked, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. 3 years in exile teaches you the language of the desert." He didn't look at her as he spoke, instead scanning the horizon through the cave opening. "Or you die." "Why were you exiled?" she ventured curiosity, overcoming her royal reserve. Idris was silent for so long that Selene thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I spoke against the neural locks, said they were cruel, said the beasts deserved better than to be brain-chained for entertainment." Selene's brow furrowed. "But the locks are humane. They prevent the creatures from feeling pain during the challenge." Idris laughed a sound without humor. "Is that what they teach you in the dome? The locks don't block pain, they amplify it. The creatures obey, because every movement against command is agony." Sleep didn't come easily after that revelation. By the 3rd day of their journey, they had reached the outskirts of an exile settlement, a collection of structures built from salvaged materials and ingenuity. Selene had expected squalor and desperation. What she found instead was a community. Children played in the shade of solar collectors. Gardens of hardy desert plants grew in terraced beds, fed by a complex water reclamation system. People moved with purpose, acknowledging Idris with respectful nods, eyeing Selene with cautious curiosity. "Welcome to Refuge," Idris said, gesturing to the settlement. "One of 12 exile communities in the outer wastes." A young girl ran up to Idris, throwing her arms around his waist. "You came back," she exclaimed, beaming up at him. "I promised I would, didn't I?" He ruffled her hair affectionately, before turning to Selene. "Princess, this is Lyra. She's our best tracker." The child couldn't have been more than 10, but her eyes held wisdom beyond her years as she regarded Selene. "You're very bright," she said, matter-of-factly. "Your clothes catch the sun. Not good for hiding." Over the following weeks, Selene learned what it meant to survive outside the protective dome of the capital. Idris taught her to find water, trapped beneath seemingly dry riverbeds, to identify which desert plants were edible and which were poisonous, to move silently across the sand to avoid attracting predators. The lessons weren't always gentle. When she complained about the coarse bread that was their staple food, Idris simply didn't share his portion the next day. When she hesitated to climb a cliff face to reach a sheltered cave, he left her below until the howling of desert predators convinced her that heights were preferable to becoming prey. "You're cruel," she accused him one evening, nursing blistered hands from a day spent helping to repair a water filtration system. "I'm practical," he corrected. "The desert doesn't care about your title or your bloodline. Neither do the beasts that hunt here. Learn or die, those are the only options." But there were moments of unexpected beauty as well. Idris showed her how certain desert flowers bloomed, only under the dual moons, their petals releasing a fragrance so sweet it could be detected from miles away. He taught her to read the stars using constellations unknown within the capital to navigate the treacherous wastes. In the exile community, Celine witnessed a different kind of strength than what she had been raised to value. The exiles shared everything: food, water, knowledge. Children were raised communally. The elderly were revered for their wisdom rather than hidden away. Everyone contributed according to their abilities, and no one was considered expendable. It was during their 6th week in the desert that royal guards finally caught up with them. Celine and Idris had been tracking a herd of desert gazelles, not to hunt them, but to locate the underground spring they inevitably led to. The whine of hover engines alerted them to the approaching patrol. "Run!" Idris commanded, pushing Celine toward a narrow ravine. "They're my people," she protested. "They won't hurt me." "They're not here for you," he replied grimly. "The call-response law protects me only while I'm with you. If they separate us, I'm dead." They fled into the maze of canyons, the patrol close behind. Celine knew these royal guards had grown up watched over by them, had trained alongside some of the younger ones. Now, they pursued her, as if she were a criminal. A plasma bolt struck the rock face inches from Idris's head, showering them with superheated stone fragments. Celine pulled him into a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through sideways. "This way," she whispered, remembering a map of the outer territories she had studied years ago. "There's a series of caves that connects to an underground river system. If we can reach it, they won't be able to track us." For hours, they navigated the dark passages, guided only by the faint, bioluminescent moss that clung to the damp stone walls. When they finally emerged, they found themselves miles from where they had entered the twin moons, high in the night sky. Exhausted, they collapsed beside a small spring, drinking deeply of the cool, sweet water. "You saved my life," Idris said quietly, studying her face in the moonlight. "Why?" Celine considered the question seriously. 6 weeks ago, she would have said it was because of the call-response law, a debt that must be honored. Now her answer was different. "Because you matter," she said simply. "Your life has value no more or less than mine." Idris's expression changed, softened. He reached out his fingertips, just barely brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've changed, Princess." "I've grown," she corrected him. "There's a difference." The following morning, they heard rumors in a small trading post King Orion had fallen ill. The coronation of the new ruler had been scheduled for the full moon just 7 days away. In the absence of Princess Celine, her cousin Darian was being prepared to take the throne. "We have to go back," Celine declared, her voice steady, with newfound resolve. "Not just for the throne, though. I would be a better ruler than Darian, but because things must change. The exile system, the neural locks, the intimidation challenge itself. None of it is necessary. None of it makes us stronger." Idris regarded her skeptically. "They'll kill me the moment we approach the dome. Your royal guards have made that clear." "Not if we enter during the coronation," Celine argued. "The ancient laws state that during the transfer of power, the sacred arena is open to all citizens who wish to witness. Even exiles can't be barred on that day." "And once we're inside, what then?" Celine's eyes gleamed with determination. "Then we show them a different kind of strength." The journey back to the capital was fraught with danger. Royal patrols had increased, combing the desert for the missing princess. Twice, they had to hide in toxic swamp regions where the patrol hover vehicles couldn't follow. Once, they spent an entire day submerged up to their necks in a mud pit, as guards passed just feet away. As they drew closer to the dome, the settlements grew more numerous, the risk of recognition greater. Selene cut her distinctive royal blonde hair short and stained it with berries to darken it. Idris traded his exile garb for the rough clothing of a desert merchant. They reached the capital on the morning of the coronation. Just as Selene had predicted, the gates stood open, pilgrims from across the planet, streaming in to witness the ascension of a new ruler. Guards checked for weapons, but in the crush of the crowd, paid little attention to faces. The sacred arena had been transformed for the ceremony. Where once there had been gates to hold beasts, now stood massive floral arrangements. The red sand had been raked into intricate patterns, symbolizing the eternal flow of royal power. At the center, on a raised platform, stood the Elders' Council, surrounding the young man who would soon be king. Darian looked nervous, his eyes darting around the arena, as if expecting the beasts of the intimidation challenge to suddenly appear. Beside him stood King Orion, leaning heavily on a ceremonial staff, his face gray with illness. Selene and Idris worked their way through the crowd, moving steadily toward the central platform. The ceremony had already begun, Elder Mira reciting the ancient words of power transfer. Soon would come the obeisance, the moment when all would bow to the new king. "Now," Selene whispered, and they pushed forward, breaking through the front line of spectators. Guards moved to intercept them, but Selene threw back her hood, revealing her face to the gasping crowd. "I claim my right of challenge," she called out, her voice ringing through the suddenly silent arena. The ceremony halted. King Orion straightened, disbelief, and then recognition dawning on his haggard face. "Selene," he whispered the word, carrying in the perfect acoustics of the arena. Elder Mira stepped forward, her ancient eyes sharp. "The Princess Selene invokes the right of challenge. The coronation must be suspended until the challenge is heard." Darian's face twisted with fury. "She failed the intimidation challenge. She has no right to be here, much less to challenge my ascension." "I did not fail," Selene replied, climbing the steps to the central platform, Idris close behind her. "I survived, but not in the way our traditions demand." She reached the top of the platform and faced the Elders' Council. With deliberate movements, she tore away her disguising cloak, revealing the ceremonial robes beneath, now weather-beaten, patched with materials from the exile communities, embellished with symbols of both royal and exile craftsmanship. "I come before you transformed," she announced. "Not as the princess who left these walls 7 weeks ago, but as someone who has seen both worlds, the world inside our dome and the world we have cast out." From within her robes, she produced a broken spear, the very one she had carried into her intimidation challenge, now stained with the blood of desert beasts, and notched from use as a tool rather than a weapon. "Our traditions tell us that to rule, we must show no fear in the face of the beasts we have enslaved and tortured." She continued, her voice gaining strength. "That leadership means domination. That courage means coldness." She bit the spear in half, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the arena. The crowd gasped. "I say this is false," Selene declared, throwing the broken pieces to the ground. "True courage is not the absence of fear, but the recognition of it. True strength is not in domination, but in cooperation. And true leadership is the ability to see value in all lives, even those we have been taught to consider beneath us." She turned, gesturing to Idris. "This man, this exile, saved my life when our neural technology failed. He taught me to survive in a world we have been taught to fear. He showed me communities built on mutual respect rather than hierarchy. If our laws demand that I reject the one who saved me, then our laws have lost their wisdom." The arena erupted in chaotic noise, some cheering, others shouting in outrage. The royal guards surged forward, weapons raised. King Orion lifted a hand, halting them. "You bring an exile to the sacred arena and expect us to listen," Darian sneered. "This is sacrilege." "Is it?" came a voice, ancient and carrying authority. Elder Mira stepped forward, her gnarled fingers clutching a scroll, so old its edges crumbled at her touch. "The original law, the one brought from Earth itself," speaks of the challenge differently. It speaks not of intimidation but of empathy, not of dominating beasts but of understanding them. She unrolled the delicate document. The seventh test of leadership. To recognize fear in others and respond with compassion, not exploitation. To form bonds across differences, not hierarchies. A murmur ran through the crowd. Our ancestors twisted the meaning over generations, Elder Mira continued. What began as a test of empathy became a display of domination. What was meant to unite us with the wild creatures of our new home became a way to subjugate them. King Orion moved forward, studying his daughter's face. "You have changed," he observed, his voice barely carrying beyond the platform. "I have grown," she corrected gently. "There's a difference." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then King Orion turned to the Elders' Council. "I propose a vote. The challenge has been misinterpreted for generations. Perhaps it is time to return to its original purpose." The deliberation lasted hours. The crowd remained witnessing history being shaped before them. Soldiers divided, some maintaining their positions around the platform, others lowering their weapons in a show of support for the princess's words. Exiles who had slipped into the capital for the coronation pushed forward, adding their voices to the debate. As the twin moons rose over the arena, Elder Mira struck her staff against the stone platform 3 times, signaling the council's decision. "The intimidation challenge shall be reformed," she announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the arena. "Henceforth, it shall be known as the empathy ritual. Those who seek leadership must demonstrate not their ability to stand unflinching before controlled beasts, but their capacity to recognize fear in others and in themselves, and respond with wisdom and compassion." She turned to Selene. "Princess Selene Oris has demonstrated this capacity. She has declared Empathy Bridge the first of a new lineage of leaders." Cheers erupted from parts of the crowd, particularly from the gathered exiles. Others remained silent, uncertain of this dramatic shift in tradition. King Orion stepped forward, removing his crown. "The throne remains mine until my passing," he declared. "But my daughter shall rule beside me as Empathy Bridge, helping to guide our people toward this new understanding." He regarded Idris, studying the exile's face. "And this man, this exile who saved the princess, what is to be done with him?" Before the council could respond, Selene spoke. "If I am to be Empathy Bridge, then let my first act be to dissolve the barriers between our peoples. Idris and those like him, those we have cast out for questioning our ways, shall be welcomed back, their knowledge and perspectives valued rather than feared." Another murmur ran through the crowd, this one mixed with both approval and concern. "It will not be easy," Idris warned quietly. "Generations of separation have created deep wounds." "Nothing worthwhile is easy," Selene replied. Then louder, addressing the entire arena. "The path forward requires all of us to learn new ways. The Dome Dwellers must learn to see the desert not as a place of punishment, but as a source of wisdom. The exiles must find it in their hearts to forgive past injustices. And together, we must create a new relationship with the wild creatures of Ara, one based on mutual respect rather than domination." In the days that followed, the capital transformed. The neural locks were removed from the arena, beasts replaced with a system Idris helped design, one that allowed the creatures to communicate discomfort or unwillingness without pain. Exile representatives were invited to join a newly formed Council of Voices, ensuring their perspectives would be heard in all future decisions. The Intimidation Challenge arena itself was repurposed. Half remained a ceremonial space, but the other half became a sanctuary where Dome Dwellers could safely observe and learn about Ara's native life, guided by former exiles, who understood these creatures not as threats, but as fellow inhabitants of their shared world. Not all embraced the changes. Some royal families left the capital in protest, establishing smaller domes in distant regions. Some exiles, too, wounded by past treatment, chose to remain in their desert communities, rather than return to the city that had cast them out. But many stayed committed to building this new vision. Celine worked tirelessly, dividing her time between learning governance from her father and venturing into the desert with Idris to better understand the exile communities and the wild places beyond. A year after her return on the night of the dual full moons, Celine stood at the edge of the dome watching as it was deactivated for the first time in 3 centuries. The barrier between the capital and the desert beyond dissolved, allowing the sweet scent of night-blooming flowers to drift through the streets. Beside her stood Idris, no longer marked as exile, now bearing the title of Wildlife Liaison, the first of its kind. "Are you afraid?" he asked softly, watching as dome-dwellers cautiously stepped beyond the city's edge, many for the first time in their lives. Celine considered the question. "Yes," she admitted. "But fear is how we know something matters." She reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining. "And this matters more than anything." Together, they walked into the Night Princess and former exile leaders of a world being reborn under the silver light of Ara's moons. Behind them, the people followed, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Before them stretched the vast desert, no longer a place of exile, but a frontier of possibility. And somewhere in the distance a shadow hunter raised its head to the moons and called not in rage or pain, but in the ancient voice of the wild, finally heard and respected by those who had once sought only to dominate it. The call echoed across the sands, carried by the night wind to every corner of Ara, a planet where intimidation was giving way to empathy, where divisions were healing through understanding, and where a princess who had once feared the wild now walked hand in hand with it, into a future bright with promise and alive with the beauty of difference embraced rather than feared.